We turn in this 9th lecture in our Power Over People series to the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was born in Geneva in 1712. Now, unlike the men that we've discussed so far, Rousseau was born into poverty. He lost his mother soon after he was born. His father was abusive, and so we're told in his magnificent Confessions, his autobiographical account, that he left his home at age 16, and he wandered through Europe for 13 years until he settled in Paris from 1741 to 1762. And it was there in Paris during this time that he wrote and published his greatest works, including the two that we're going to be analyzing today, his Discourse on the Origins of Inequality and his Social Contract. Rousseau was an idealist because, unlike Machiavelli, but like Plato, he had an optimistic view of human nature and of the future of humanity. And yet he combined this optimism with a harsh criticism of his own contemporary society. He denounced the contemporary society of Europe as corrupt and depraved, and in this sense he was like Plato, who thought of his own society in Athens, you'll recall, as being corrupt. In this sense, then, Rousseau was like Plato for having a philosophy of human nature, sensing in human nature a vast potential, and yet that potential trapped in a contemporary system that suffocates our very best interests. So we may say of Rousseau that he emerged in 18th century France as a revolutionary who was very much ahead of his time, because, of course, he anticipated the French Revolution of 1789, which was to come only 27 years after he published his great work, The Social Contract. And yet, while he was ahead of his time in this sense, he paradoxically sought to return to Plato and Plato's idealism that had occurred, remember, 2,100 years before Rousseau. Because Rousseau challenged Machiavelli, the cynic and the realist that we saw in the last lecture, he challenged Machiavelli, and particularly Machiavelli's human nature, that dark, grim view of human nature that we saw. Machiavelli's view that there was no relationship between ethics and politics. Rousseau took Machiavelli to task on precisely this point, arguing that there must be an inextricable relationship between morality and politics. And he does this, he challenges Machiavelli in this way, in the name of Plato. So, ironically, we see that Rousseau has more in common with Plato in this sense, in his optimism, in his revolutionary spirit. He has more in common with Plato than I think Aristotle had in common with Plato. And this points to an extraordinary fact, and that is Aristotle, Plato's own student, differs, it seems to me, with Plato more than Rousseau, coming 2,100 years after Plato. It's extraordinary from one point of view because of the gulf in time, but it's not so extraordinary from another, and that is that we're dealing here with conceptual clusters of ideas. And so far in this series we've talked about a cluster represented by the idealists. Rousseau is, with Plato, then representative of the school of idealism in his optimism and his revolutionary spirit, and this in sharp contrast with the realists especially represented by Machiavelli, that harsh, grim view that we're to see soon when we talk about Freud in the lecture after next. So my argument will be, has been really implicitly, that we can group political theory roughly into two schools of thought, very broadly, of course, and that is the idealists on the one hand and the realists on the other. And when we make this contrast, we're contrasting not only as we did previously between Plato and Machiavelli, but now we're making the contrast sharply between Machiavelli and Rousseau. Rousseau, then, unlike Machiavelli, like Plato, is a real visionary who imagines an ideal society before him And this ideal society he called not the Republic, as Plato called his society, but Rousseau looked forward to the future and imagined a society called the civil state. And we'll talk about that soon. But in the civil state there is an organic unit, much of the same kind of unit that Plato described. Remember when we talked about Plato's second wave, that is that wave of revolutionary change that has to sweep over the corrupt Athens and institute a whole new society, that organic society in which, as Plato says, and Rousseau will say exactly in the same terms, we want to create a society that is so unified that just as with a single person, if that person loses a limb, the whole body suffers. So in this state that we want to create, if a single person is lost, then the whole body politic will suffer. Rousseau says that that is his goal too, to achieve that degree of unity, that degree of empathy among the members of his society, that society called the civil state. And finally, like Plato, Rousseau believed, certainly as Machiavelli did not believe, and as the realists generally do not, in the effectiveness of education. He called Plato's Republic the finest treatise on education ever written. And while we see in terms of the idealists, both Plato and Rousseau as idealists, affirming this vision of the ideal state, both of them too, as idealists, have a method. And the method is that of education. There is a way to reach that ideal. And it is through the slow, the laborious process of training people who will be able to lead us into that kind of society. Rousseau and Plato are profoundly political theorists, but they are also educational theorists. And happily enough, we find Rousseau and Plato taught, say, at Columbia University, not only in the core curriculum, the undergraduate core curriculum, which features their works on politics, but also in Teachers College, where they focus on Rousseau's Émile, that marvelous work on education that Rousseau wrote, as well as on Plato's Republic. We want to underline this because the idealists have a strength that other theorists often do not have, and that is they have a philosophy of education. It is not just that they are visionaries who imagine that someday, in a utopian sense, we might be able to reach this grand, brave new world. It's that they plan through a method of education and how to do it. Plato sets forth that paradigm in the Republic, and that is his contribution to political society. That is, politics does represent a rescue operation in which we will be able to achieve this new state through political organization. But in order to achieve the political organization, we must have an educational system in place, a right educational system that will prepare people for it. Now, of course, there were essential differences between Plato and Rousseau. And one of the key differences, as we'll see, is that Plato believed in inequality, and Rousseau, as a democratic theorist, believes in equality. And these differences, the differences that stem from that core contrast between them will be apparent as we contrast their perspectives. The perspectives that we'll look at will be the way in which they see society and human nature evolving, and particularly the way in which Rousseau sees his society evolving in terms of what I'll call three visions that Rousseau has, which in some respects are like Plato, but in many respects are unlike Plato. Three ideal societies, and these societies begin with first the vision of the past, and then second, his vision of the present, which I said is hardly ideal at all. It's a vision of the corrupt society that he's in, and then his vision of the future. First, the vision of the past. Rousseau has been called a back-to-nature theorist, and I think that that is a disservice to Rousseau. I think that he doesn't want us to go back to a previous time. He wants us to go forward, as I indicated, to a civil state. But some theorists, some writers, like Voltaire, read Rousseau's discourse on the origins of inequality and said, Jean-Jacques, you want us to go back into the trees and live like monkeys again. Rousseau doesn't want that. He wants us to go forward, as I've said, to a new kind of society. And yet he takes from his view of nature and the state of nature something which Plato did not do. And that is an ideal of human nature, a vision of human nature, which is to become extremely important in building his civil state. What does he say then in terms of his vision of the state of nature, the vision of a previous world that is to have such influence on the future? He says that if we look back, and he talks about this in his discourse on the origins of inequality, if we look back to perceive what he calls the operations of the human soul before they developed in modern society, he perceives in that soul, in that state of nature, in that original primitive human nature, two principles which were prior to modern development and modern reason. And those two principles turn out to be two instincts or two motivations, which he says relate closely one to the other. The two instincts are, first, the instinct for self-preservation, and the other, and these are his words, the other constitutes, he says, a natural repugnance to seeing any sentient being, especially our fellow man, perish or suffer. And then he goes on, as long as natural man did not resist the inner impulse of compassion, he would never harm another man or even another sentient being, except in the legitimate instance of self-protection or self-defense. So these are the two original instincts that we have, the two key motivations in our personality. And these are deep within us. They're profound instinctive qualities. And notice how different they are from Hobbes, yet similar from Hobbes. That is, Hobbes had a view of human nature, and it was that individuals in the state of nature existed in a condition that was nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short, Hobbes said in the Leviathan, that grim, dark, realistic view of human nature. Hobbes said, too, that human nature in this state, in this original condition, dominated by an impulse to preserve one's own life, and self-protection, control were important in this. But Hobbes would not have said ever that along with that instinct of self-preservation was an instinct of compassion. That's Rousseau's idealist perception, that man is basically, fundamentally, in terms of his nature, a compassionate and sensitive being whose, he says, natural instincts are generous, merciful, and humane. That's his essential vision of the past, and he's to maintain that view of the benign nature of human nature throughout his work. And it's for that reason that some people call Rousseau not just an optimist, but a romantic, because he has that optimistic view of human nature that perhaps idealizes or romanticizes what we were. Nevertheless, he's not arguing, as I would emphasize, that we want to go back to that state. We must use those instincts and build on those instincts to go forward into another way of thinking and being, the civil state. Now, on the way to the civil state, we are stuck in this stage of modernity. How did we get there? What has happened? Well, modernity has corrupted us. The modernity of the present contemporary society, in this case of the 18th century Europe, particularly 18th century France. And this is his second view of the human species and our evolution, that we have taken a wrong turn. And this wrong course that has eventuated in the present is a state of corruption, much like Plato's Athens in the sense of a political state that is rent with avarice and inhumanity. But unlike Plato, Rousseau attributes this state, the rottenness of our contemporary society, to our vast cities, our rampant commercialism, and the institution of private property all gone awry. As a result of this kind of alienation. We've become isolated from one another. So that we say, Rousseau says, and this is his description of the second society that he imagines, the present society that he's looking at, we say, at the sight of a suffering man, he's no business of mine. And this defies and defiles our deepest instincts of humanity for us to do this. In his discourse on inequality, he deplores this current state of insensitivity, writing that for modern man, and I quote from the discourse, his fellow man can be killed with impunity underneath his very window. He has merely to place his hands over his ears and argue with himself a little in order to prevent nature, that is, that innate instinct to help another, in order to prevent nature, which rebels within him and cries out within him, from identifying himself with the man being assassinated or tortured. So this is his view of the corrupt state of the present. We've got the vision of the modern, of the natural society, now the view, the harsh, critical view of the present society. What, again, has caused this corruption? How have we gone so far wrong? We have experienced this as a result of our present mode of living, our technology and all of its trappings, our urban existence that brings us together only to make us feel more separate and apart, so that we are, to take the expression that's constantly used to describe our contemporary society, lonely in a crowd. That kind of existence, Rousseau, give him credit, anticipates in the middle of the 18th century, before the great megapolises and huge urban complexes that have made us feel so alienated, before they even emerged. The line just mentioned from his discourse on the origins of inequality about his fellow man being killed with impunity underneath his very window, that line suggests many experiences of the city. But it's always reminded me, as I think of this, the state of corruption that Rousseau is describing me, of the case of Kitty Genovese, because that has become a classic textbook case of the corruption of humanity in the city that I happen to know best, where I've lived for much of my life, New York City. The case of Kitty Genovese, I'm sure some of you recall, occurred on March 13th, 1964, when Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old waitress living and working in Kew Gardens, Queens, New York, was murdered. She was murdered right in front of the building where she lived, in Kew Gardens, Queens. The circumstances of her murder recall what Rousseau wrote, I think, about modern man's capacity to hear someone killed under his window as he turns a deaf ear to her screams. In the case of Kitty Genovese, the killing occurred in a way that I think Rousseau might have understood and certainly anticipates. Her murder was reported in the New York Times with a story that opened with this line: "For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens." That's the way the story began, and it initiated a whole study of what's become known as the Bad Samaritan complex. And we want to know the story because it, I think, bears on precisely the argument that is the degree of corruption that we find ourselves, and then to analyze why. A.M. Rosenthal, as the New York Times columnist, has written a splendid book on this called 38 Witnesses. And the story, as he has, as a young investigative reporter at that time, explored it, is essentially this: that Kitty Genovese, that night of March 13th, 1964, was making her way home from where she worked, and as she approached the complex of buildings in Queens where she lived, a large complex of apartments, she sensed a man behind her. She began to walk more quickly to reach the telephone that was right in front of her apartment building, to call the police, to call for help, but he was on her. And during the next 30 minutes, as he attacked her, as he stabbed her and raped her, he first looked up as the lights went on in some of the windows and left. And then he came back after a few moments, returned, and again attacked her. And once again, lights went on in more of the windows. Someone cried out, "What's going on there?" But no one intervened. No one even reached for the telephone. And then finally he came back the last time and killed her. And during this time she was screaming her life away, screaming, "Help, please help me," to people who knew her in that building but would not come to her aid, not even reaching for the telephone. When afterwards these 38 people, some of them were questioned by reporters, and they were in fact questioned a great deal as a result of this episode because it became such a cause in the city of New York. As they were questioned, they said first, "Well, I didn't come because I thought it was a lover's quarrel." And then others said, "I just couldn't bother. It was not really my business." And then a woman said that she told her husband, please call the police, after Kitty was screaming and screaming minute after minute. And her husband said, "No, it's not our business." And she told this person after, one of the reporters, "I made a mistake, a tragic mistake. If only I had listened to my heart." And that line, I think, captures what Rousseau was really about in terms of the way in which he was trying to describe was within us. If only we listen to our hearts. Rousseau, the romantic, insisting that the impulse is there, but somehow we manage to rationalize it away and are not in tune with our deepest instincts. 30 years after Kitty Genovese was murdered, another article appeared in the New York Times on the anniversary of her killing. And the article begins by citing this paragraph that I mentioned a moment ago about how for more than half an hour 38 respectable law-abiding citizens watched the killer and did nothing. And then this article 30 years later, written in 1990, picks it up and says, "So began a story that shook this city's soul. None of the 38 people incredibly lifted a hand for Catherine Genovese. Kitty's screams pierced through to a place where there is no space and time. Only the pain of living in a city that too often does not care. At the beginning, 'Oh my God, he stabbed me,' and the final shriek, 'I'm dying, I'm dying.' Some see Kitty's slaying as the point from which the city began its long slide. One, this article goes, is Bruce O'Connor, who owns Bailey's Pub beneath what was Kitty's apartment at 82 Austin Street. He's lived his whole life in Kew Gardens, long enough to see tree-lined streets become crack havens, and long enough to be making plans to move to Florida. There's no one death, O'Connor says, that has come since that can compare to it. It's the point we look back to and say, that's where things changed. The beginning of the end of decency." That's a comment that's representative as we look back on this, because there has been a Kitty Genovese Memorial Conference established at Fordham University. And when it met several years ago, C. Everett Koop, this former Surgeon General of the United States, spoke at the conference and said, "Kitty Genovese died because we lack in this country, tragically, a sense of community. When people learn to care, when they accept the fact that there may be risks to caring, when they agree to take those risks in order to build a more secure society, where we may not be at risk walking our streets at night, only then might we be able to heal our open wounds of alienation." Well, there's few other better descriptions of our corrupt society, as Rousseau would call it, than that C. Everett Koop has described. What's wrong with us? What is at the seat of this bad Samaritan complex that this Memorial Conference at Fordham University bringing legions of sociologists and psychologists, even anthropologists and political scientists and economists to it, all studying and trying to figure out what's wrong. Well, the urban nightmare is precisely this. It's the essence of the urban condition that we're in. One screams for help, and those around, witnessing one's pain, avert their eyes, just as those who turned away from the Jews did in Germany and Europe when the Nazis came to get the Jews. People avert their eyes. They turn away from others in pain. Once the process starts, there's no end to this nightmare. And this is Rousseau's condition. This is the corruption of humanity as we know it. But how did these uncaring attitudes develop? Well, Rousseau would say first and foremost, because remember he is an education theorist, as a result of a bad educational system, a system that fails to teach values, a system that is loath to comment on caring, that sees itself disconnected from the goal of producing a caring and a sharing society. That's Rousseau's fundamental answer. That is, that the educational system is responsible for this, and the educational system is clearly wrong. Rousseau, though, blames not just education, he blames the institutions of our society for the selfishness, for the incapacity that we have for encouraging natural instincts. He blames it on the way in which the institutions of our society have produced a state of inequality, that we think more about accumulating mountains of things than we do about relationships among people and the interaction among, say, friends. The inequality of wealth, from Rousseau's point of view, and here is where he anticipates Marx, which of course we'll turn next time, the inequality of wealth that exists in our society, Rousseau says, is reinforced especially by the institution of private property. And anticipating Marx, as well, of course, as the French Revolution, he comes down on this institution of private property as one of the first causes of the separation that exists among humans, and the way in which our modern system has reinforced this institution. And so in his discourse on inequality, he reflects on the origins of the disparity of wealth that clearly existed then and continues to exist. And I'll be emphasizing this in the Marx lecture next time. Rousseau writes in Marxist terms in his discourse on inequality, the first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of our modern society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, "Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one." This, of course, a real revolutionary spirit, and that is share the wealth. Rousseau says that as a result of this lust for private property, there emerges, to reinforce it, consuming ambition, the zeal for raising the relative level of one's fortune, less out of real need, of course, than in order to put oneself above others. It is this that inspires in all men, then, this wicked tendency to harm one another. He inveighs against competition and rivalry, against opposition of interests. Always, he says, the hidden desire to profit at the expense of someone else. All these ills are the first effect, he says, of property, and the inseparable offshoot of inequality. So it's Rousseau, remember, the watchwords of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, or solidarity. Rousseau, the prophet of equality, now speaks to this problem, and that is that it is inequality that has caused so much of this problem, so many of these problems among us. So much of this sense of separation. That is his basic first point. So as modern society develops, then, Rousseau says that it gave new fetters to the weak and new forces to the rich. Irretrievably destroyed natural liberty, established forever the law of property and of inequality, changed adroit usurpation into an irrevocable right, and for the profit of a few ambitious men, henceforth subjected the entire human race to labor, servitude, and misery. Once again, those are in the socialist tradition, in the revolutionary tradition, and one can imagine, as happened, Marx reading those words and being inspired by them. So it was this passionate cry of injustice that fired the French Revolution 35 years after Rousseau wrote this discourse, a classic that concluded its last lines declaring that it is obviously contrary to the law of nature, however it may be defined, for a handful of people to gorge themselves on superfluities while the starving multitude lacks basic necessities. Modern society, then, it's a cult, a culture of uncaring elites. This is the present that he's describing. Gross social inequality. What can be done to correct this state of appalling injustice and inequality? Well, Rousseau envisages, as we said, a future, a grand future of social justice, of freedom, of equality, a future establishing a civil state by a new social contract. Of course, words that give us the title of his great book, The Social Contract. We want a political system, he says, marked by liberty, equality, and community. Rousseau, the idealist, the optimist, the revolutionary, because of his vision of this civil state. And the civil state is presented in his mature work, The Social Contract, which was written in 1762, 8 years after the discourse on inequality. Now, hope lies, he says, in the formation of this new social contract, an agreement that can produce what he calls a civil state through the creation of, again, his term, an original term, difficult term, the general will. And by the general will, he means a consensus of civic spirit that allows us to act each for all in a true sense of community, a caring and sharing society, to recover the reserves of compassion and the sense of common interest that every society can experience at its best, if only it can now begin again. The social contract, then, wants, as certain figures in our political scene want us to do today, the new contract. Remember, the contract for a new America. People today talk continually about the contract, the new contract, not just on the Republican side, but on the left as well. We must begin again in the United States. Well, the contract theory didn't begin with Rousseau. It begins with Plato, actually, when in almost an aside, Glaucon says in Plato's Republic that a contract must form in order to establish the origins of justice. Now, that's the first mention of the contract in political theory. Everything goes back to Plato, of course, and Plato is the one who initiates that. But then the contract theory is developed not by Plato later, but by Hobbes, and then Locke, and then finally Rousseau. It is Rousseau that gives it its fullest expression, because there are so many theories related to the contract that Rousseau builds on, and more than Locke, more than Hobbes, he has got the contract theory down pat. Well, he begins the social contract with his famous lines: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." That's the state of the corrupt society. That is, we are born with these free impulses, impulses of compassion and all the rest. Nature, human nature is benign, but everywhere we are in chains. The chains are the bondage of inequality that we find in our corrupt modern society that ensnare us all, above all, as he says, ensnare our minds, that we're unable to think imaginatively and creatively to shape another society. Ensnare, he says, the chains ensnare rich and poor alike, because they instill in us this sense of separateness. We have experienced in our society then the wrong kind of socialization. We need another sort of education. A new social contract initiates that. It gives us even more security than we ever had before, because we won't fear one another. We will, in a true sense of community, be able to interact. We'll be able to achieve a sense of belonging and ownership of our public spaces, because the spaces themselves will truly belong to the public. Protection, then, safety, comes from equality. But this requires building a whole new sense of self. We need to define ourselves not in terms of things, but in terms of relationships with others. The new social contract then gives us this new freedom to interact each with one another, to move about our environment freely because we can feel secure. And once again, the Kitty Genovese illustration, it seems to me, is right on target in terms of what he means. That is, if only we could transform New York City by developing in that impossibly alienated urban situation a true sense of community, then we would have real security. Security not from the prisons that we're building at an unprecedented rate, nor from the police force that we are multiplying at an unprecedented rate, but security from being able to walk our streets, able to enter our parks at night without fear. It takes a lot to even imagine this, not only in New York City, but in most of the cities, big cities in the United States, for all of us to have that kind of security and to buy that security not through protection with police and prisons, but rather through building a sense of loving and caring relationships among us. The educational system, the new social contract that initiates it, is responsible for that. And when he talks about the civil state, then, he says this: a passage must occur. And this use of the term passage suggests the journey that each of us as individuals must experience, but the society as well. We need a transformation, a passage. The passage from the old society to the civil state must produce a remarkable change in man. It must substitute justice for mere instinct in his behavior. That is, to build on the old natural instincts and to build them into a state of real, a just sense of humanity. Must give his actions a moral quality that they previously lacked. Only then, when the voice of duty and responsibility replaces physical impulse and right replaces appetite, does man who had hitherto taken only himself into account find himself forced to act on other principles. If we can do this, our faculties will be exercised and developed. Our ideas will be broadened. Our feelings will be ennobled. Our entire soul will be elevated to such a height that we might seek constantly to bless the happy moment that pulled us away from our previous societies, that transformed us from stupid, limited, selfish, narrow people into intelligent beings and men. Well, that's quite a vision as to what might be achieved. How can the social contract induce such a change? Through laws. Rousseau is a political theorist. The educational system just doesn't come about all by itself. Legislation must be passed. Legislation to create a sense of equality instead of inequality. Legislation that will not reinforce the traditions of private property that we have, but the opposite of public property. That will enforce a sense of public obligation and public responsibility. instead of selfishness and inequality. The educational system must socialize people into a spirit of all for one and one for all. Rousseau was surely here influenced by Plato, who emphasized profoundly that the system must be changed, but the system will be changed only through, as Rousseau says, a change of self, a change of attitude. We must get to the values of the society, the core of the problem, which is the way we think about ourselves and about one another. Rousseau redefines the very concept of freedom, insisting that freedom must not be seen as merely the ability to act as we wish, but rather we must, as he says, conceive of freedom in a moral sense, of moral or civil liberty that will incorporate into our value of freedom a sense of responsibility, so that freedom becomes then the freedom to act as we should act. And what does that mean? We liberate ourselves from the illusions of separateness, from the ignorance that engulfs us. That kind of liberation, that sort of psychological liberation, is not the narrow political liberation that Locke was talking about or the liberals were talking about. It's a much more basic form of emancipation than that. It is emancipating individuals to enter into a true sense of oneness. It is the freedom from the kind of fear that inhibited the 38 witnesses, and freedom to help another in need that those people should have had, knowing that such mutual aid must be the basis of a caring society. And so Rousseau is very specific that the social contract must change private property into public property as much as possible, defining need in terms of what an individual really requires and not simply what he wants. And then Rousseau speaks of the general will. And the general will is this civic sense, this surge of public responsibility that individuals will feel as a result of this uplifting form of education. And Rousseau quite rightly says that the general will cannot in a corrupt society be defined in terms of majority rule any more than it could be defined in terms of unanimous expression of opinion. The general will is more than that, it's higher than that. If it were simply unanimous opinion, then the 38 witnesses would have had the general will when they all decided unanimously not to come to Kitty Genovese's aid. But the general will is the transcendent moral standard of values that identifies a society at its best. And people have referred to the general will as that immense surge of patriotic spirit that swept over England during the Blitz, when they all, as a people, unselfishly decided that they must resist the Nazi challenge. Now that kind of spirit, that surge of will, unites a people, holds them together, makes them identify with one another, except that Rousseau would say it's not enough for a surge of patriotic spirit to last the period of time that the British felt it during the Blitz. It has to become a habit of goodness that individuals feel over a continuing period of time, so that they will enter into a society that has a tradition of thinking and of caring as part of its very fabric. What is Rousseau's lesson? His lesson, of course, is that he wants us to think in terms of our responsibility to one another, our obligation to the body politic. He, more than any other modern political theorists, any other thinker, says to us, ask, my fellow human beings, not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Politics can create this kind of state, but it relies ultimately on each one of us asking ourselves the meaning of compassion and our ability to enter into a truly caring society.